It's great. So again, welcome. My name is Manie Schweigert, and I'm with Women in Product. Women Product is an organization that was just started by our senior product managers. Actually started 1 year ago, last May. The leaders got together and we're just talking about, who's going to the Grace Hoppers event, right? And so one of the ladies said, hey, I wish we have a conference where product managers, women product managers can get together and really collaborate and share some ideas and really learn from one another. So that's how Women in Product got started. Where I came in is to establish the community as a nonprofit organization. We are 501(c). We have our trademark as Women Products. So if you want to learn more about what we do in our community and also the upcoming events, go and check out our website. It's womenpm.org. And if you haven't heard, we're launching this our second annual conference in September. How many of you are a part of Women in Product community on Facebook group? Yay! Awesome, great. And those of you who are not, go ahead and make your request for Women PM on our Facebook group. And also, how many of you are signed up as subscribers to our newsletter, weekly newsletter? That's wonderful, great. And if you haven't done so, go to our website and click on the link for Get Our Newsletter and go ahead and sign up. There's great opportunities communicated through our newsletter on a weekly basis, an opportunity for you to find out about different job opportunities as well too. So. You're looking to transition into a new role. Our corporate sponsors have posted a lot of cool, positions on there. So just check it out. And also we have a mentoring circle. So if you're interested in that, we have over 100 mentoring circle that we have launched worldwide. So our community is just not here within the Bay Area. It's across the United States as well as around the world. So this September conference is going to bring all those women together and really have an opportunity to collaborate, network, and learn from one another. So tonight, I'm so honored to really introduce you to our awesome list of panelists here. We're partnering with Google and Google Launchpad Space to bring these ladies to you. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Ellie. And Ellie Powers is going to be our moderator for tonight, and we'll introduce the rest of the speakers. Just before that, I just want to let you know the flow of the event tonight. We'll have an opportunity for the panelists to share with us for the next 45 minutes. At 8 o'clock, we'll take some questions that you might have. Some of these speakers may be available afterwards for questions as well too, but we'll try to close around 8:30. And for those of you who use the parking space in the garage that I sent you the information on, they close at 9, so you make sure you go grab the car and exit that by 9 o'clock, okay? And should you have any additional questions after this event, feel free and email me at womenpm@gmail.com or info@womenpm.org, okay? And I'll get to you as soon as possible. And one last request. Tomorrow we'll be sending out a survey. It's your opportunity to give us a feedback of how the events went. And we'd love to hear more things that you want to see happening, topics that you want for us to be able to present on. So we would appreciate your feedback. So sit back and enjoy the events tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to be hosting the event here at the SF Launchpad Space. So without further ado, I'd love to bring on all of our panelists. Panelists, please come out and join me. We're going to move on here. So in case you forget our names, every person will be sitting under their photo, so you can remember who they are and what they work on in case you're curious later. We're very excited to have 4 amazing women from different parts of Google, all product managers, all very experienced in their field, to talk with you about a very important subject that a lot of us as product managers need to do, which is using data to build great products. At Google, we are very data-driven, as we like to think, which is good and bad, and we're going to talk about both of those things. And a lot of us in our jobs are always trying to find better ways or new approaches. So we're excited to bring together such a wide variety of people from different parts of Google to share how each of these different teams are approaching data-driven product development. So without further ado, I'm going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves. So I'll start with myself. So I'm Ellie Powers. I've been at Google almost 6 years. I worked in the Play group, the Android group, and now I'm a group product manager working on the Chrome browser.
Hey everybody, I'm Jennifer Liu, PM Director at Google. Started at Google back in 2004. Worked in a variety of areas, billing and payments, internal systems, worked on mobile ads before the iPhone and Android came out, worked on search, and in the past several years I've been working on Google Shopping.
I have one question for you. I actually forgot to say this about myself, but if there's something maybe unexpected or surprising that you could say about yourself that maybe people don't know, that would be great. And I'll give you this microphone back.
Okay. All right, so that was semi-planted. I was thinking about what to say for this particular question. What's something that most people wouldn't know about me? So I semi-embarrassing admit, one fact about me is back in high school, I was homecoming princess. And I got to sit in a car and wave my hand in a little float that went by. But actually the reason I admit to this is because I do think that we all sometimes have different perceptions or different kind of stereotypes or preconceived notions about different types of folks. And so I share this because I think it's important that we step back and we also realize that no matter where you come from, whether you were science club president or homecoming princess or wherever you're from, whatever's your style, whether you're loud or soft or however you work, you can make it work as a product manager at Google. So I share that to kind of also hint at some of the diversity that you'll be hearing about even with this particular panel.
Cool. I'm Ellie Miller. I am a senior product manager for YouTube and video ads. I started at Google in 2005 on Halloween, which was a pretty fun day to start at Google because Google does Halloween pretty seriously. So over my time at Google, I actually started in the sales team. So my very first job was approving text ads for advertisers. I think of it as like the Google equivalent of starting in the mailroom. It's a great way to kind of get to know the guts of the business. And through working on that, I moved into a role between the sales and product team as an AdWords product specialist. And from that team, got to work directly with the team I transferred to product management with, which was the AdWords UI or the AdWords front end team. And then about a year and a half ago, I transferred to the YouTube and video ads focused part of that team. So it's been an exciting transition. So something that people may not know about me. So one of the facts that many people do know about me is that I'm a violinist in my spare time. So I play in the Oakland Symphony across the Bay Bridge. And but a fun fact about that is in 2013, the symphony was invited to be the orchestra playing the the national anthems for the World Baseball Classic at AT&T Park. So I got to play violin on the field at AT&T Park, which is pretty awesome for a big Giants fan, which is a bit tough this year for anyone who's a Giants fan. But that was a pretty fun memory, and I actually got to fist bump Angel Pagan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shenaz Zack, Senior PM on Pixel right now. Even I've been at Google for approximately 11 years. Unfortunately, haven't got a chance to work with any of these ladies at 11 years at Google. I just kind of started meeting them like last week. In my 11 years at Google, I've been at YouTube for 5 years before Ellie joined. Search, Google Plus, and now on Pixel, like I said. It's not a fun fact, but a fact that not a lot of people know about me is that prior to joining Google, I pursued my passion of filmmaking. And I was a filmmaker. And a professional film editor, and I co-produced with an Emmy award-winning producer a documentary about AIDS in Ethiopia. So it was an amazing experience. And one thing that I learned over there, which I hold close to my self, even for product management, is that you cannot make a film alone. No matter how good you are, you need a crew. And that same thing applies for product management. You need a whole crew to build a good product. And that's something I hold close to myself.
My name's Yvonne Chou. I'm a group product manager working in display ads. I've been at Google for a year, so I just had my year anniversary last week, so I represent the person who hasn't been there that long. So I've been in Silicon Valley for 20 years working at various companies, including Tellme, Skype, and Flipboard. And the fun fact I have is that actually 18 years ago, I worked at a startup that was right next to Shoreline Park, and small startup. And I would go and have lunch with a friend of mine who was also at a small startup named Google. And that was 18 years ago, and then maybe about 16 years ago, I actually had a chance to join Google, and didn't do that. But the main takeaway here is, like, I'm at Google now, and I really don't regret anything that I've done over the last 20 years. Everything has been a really huge, building experience, and I think that's something that, as a product manager, you just need to continue to build and grow and look for new opportunities and optimize for that.
I guess I'll eat my own dog food by answering the question. I guess something a lot of people don't know about me is I do improv comedy in my free time. So that's something where I feel a lot more comfortable when I don't know what I'm going to say next. So yeah, I guess with that, I would also say that I'm an intuition-driven person. I'm a people-driven person. I wouldn't necessarily put myself at the top of the list about being a data-driven person. So this is going to be an interesting conversation for me to learn from all of these folks who maybe are a little bit more data-driven than I am. So to get started, one of the most common questions we get as product managers, and I get this all the time, like every single exec review we have to do, like, how do you measure success? How do you pick which metrics are most important for your product? There's an infinite number of things that you can measure, but how do you narrow down that list and say, like, these are the most important things that could be measured for this particular product? Who wants to take this one first?
Yeah. All right. So this is obviously a key question, is like, I'm going to build a product. How do I show that it's successful, or know that it's successful? And so we have something at Google, which I've actually used even prior to joining Google, called OKRs, which is really, it's called Objectives and Key Results. And what that does is, like, really let you define what is important about what you're building. And I think there's no magic to choosing the metric. The main thing is that it helps you keep your eye on the ball. Because when you build a product, there will be a million different forces that are coming in, customers, or like your CEO, or like someone in the sales organization, who are telling you that you need to build this in order to get to the next, to success. And so you need to have that North Star to actually point to be able to reference and make sure that you don't lose sight of what it is. So it's more important that you have that objective and key result than what it necessarily is. There are different types of metrics, really. There's the ones that you put out there to basically define, like, how your product is doing. And it's what you share with the company, or you share with customers. And those are, like, we call them hero metrics. Like, what's the hero metric for your product? And then there's the metrics that you look at, and you look at very critically for, how is my product doing? And those are really important because you don't want to confuse them. You don't want to confuse yourself that your hero metric is that your product's so great, when you really should be looking at all the different aspects of it in a very critical way. So the main thing about OKRs that I want to point out is to keep us honest and keep us having our eye on that ball, is that it's, we actually say, like, if you score yourself a 1.0, then, like, then you've, like, made yourself, your metric has been too unambitious. So actually what you're trying to shoot for is to have an ambitious enough metric that like a 0.7 is really what the sweet spot of, like, where you've, like, really done a good job. And then the other thing is that it's actually not part of our, performance. So you don't look at OKRs to say, like, did you do well in our performance cycle, which is really important, that you kind of take apart, once again, like, looking at, like, what those hero metrics are versus, like, critically looking at the product, just how you're doing it, to make sure that you're not conflating those two.
I'll add maybe one thing to that. So kind of along the lines of hero metrics, one of the things I have struggled with in the past is, okay, I'm working on this feature or this improvement to a feature that seems obviously good to do, but there's, like, no way it's going to move revenue or retention or anything like that. This happens a lot in front-end products, because a lot of times your goal is really to make a workflow easier, which maybe in the long run may contribute to these hero metrics. So it can be helpful to kind of situate those products in the sense of, they're prioritized because they, in the long run, should contribute to these hero metrics, and we agree on how to prioritize those features. But within that individual feature or piece of functionality or workflow improvement, what are the things that make that true? So that could be satisfaction with an individual feature, that could be good usability results, that could be good adoption, that could be that it resonates with the target user for that feature. So the hero metrics definitely are kind of like this pulse that kind of help us stay all on the same page. But it can be helpful to really kind of be honest about these smaller improvements that are super important not to overlook, but may not actually be directly contributing to that hero metric. So that's something I've found kind of helpful to learn over the years.
Yeah, I would add, I really like the concept of a hero metric, and it is very important you don't confuse these different things. And sometimes it's important to also think through there's different levels and reasons for the metrics. So oftentimes we'll have something at the very top level that's kind of like a hero metric, but it's something that you really do to evangelize the team and be like, look, we're getting there. We're hitting this billion run rate. We're growing our product by this many users. And it's something where you can really motivate the team and get the team looking at, oh, okay, look, we're making progress. There could be multiple ways of getting there, multiple ways of interpreting that metric, but it's a rallying metric for the team at the top level. At the next level, there's production metrics. How is my product actually doing? And oftentimes it's not one metric, it's at least a set of metrics in being able to look at the product from various angles, whether it's from a user angle, from a partner angle, from an advertiser angle, or a long-term Google angle. It's really looking at production and seeing how is my product doing, which is a factor of what you do from a product standpoint, but also what you do as you work cross-functionally with sales, with operations, with a variety of folks that you work closely to build that product with. Lastly, I would say the last layer would be more at I would say closer to the engineering and product level. This is where, as you make launch decisions, there are lots of details. And then this is where it's all the slicing and all the nuances and all the details and the guts of the metrics really comes into play in evaluating and interpreting those metrics and determining if what you're doing is good for the user or is good for the merchant or is achieving the goal that you set out to do. And a lot of times what we have checks and balances to make sure that it's not just you incentivized to drive your project forward and launch it, but there's also checks and balances with different folks on extended teams to make sure you're reviewing that feature in a critical way and making sure that it is reaching the goals that you're looking for. So just remember, sometimes there's different levels of metrics depending on what your goal.
I'm going to add an example. So I want to just add a quick example over here. Like, I completely agree with all of this. Two things is, you should be willing to change your hero metric if you think that is not working. That is one thing that you should hold. Like, you shouldn't be tied to it. Like, you see the product has a different hero metric that's going to, so willing to change that. And the second one is logging metrics that will give you that hero metric. And I'll give you an example. Just recently, we launched a feature, and I got the click-through rate, and I was like, but how many impressions? They're like, oh, we don't log that. I'm like, so there's nothing I can do with that click-through rate if you just don't tell me what the impressions are, right? So it's just, as a PM, having you and your team know that you're logging as many metrics which inform the hero metrics, and then sometimes it's, for me, is pastime to kind of glean over the metrics and see if I'm getting some insights which might not be obvious, right? So that's how I kind of, like, you have to be willing to move.
Well, thank you all for that. So next question. How do you use the right type of data for different types of problems? How do you be sure that you're asking the right question and then selecting the right type of data to answer that?
Did you
No, go ahead.
okay. Did you want to go?
No, go ahead.
So one of the things on my mind for selecting the right type of data is kind of getting back to what I mentioned earlier. So what is the context and what are you able to move in the context of, you know, all of these larger goals and like the general vision that the team is moving towards. So, you know, one example, maybe a counter example that I've seen can be enticing is if you have a revenue metric, you want to tie everything to the revenue metric. So if you're launching a feature, revenue touched, it's a terrible metric. It can maybe be directional in terms of like your overall coverage of usage and who's using the feature, but it's not really telling you about what that feature individually is doing and what its role is in the broader ecosystem to actually drive change. So often this kind of comes back to asking the right questions. So if we believe that, you know, I'm going to use an ads example. So we worked a lot on improving our bulk features, so allowing large advertisers to quickly make changes across many, many ad campaigns and many, many accounts. What are we trying to do there? Are we trying to help large advertisers use the UI more? Are we trying to help them be more efficient? Are we trying to reduce time spent? So it can be really important to sort of think through what's the larger goal from all the different perspectives we can look at this: UX, PM, engineering. Where do we think the key drivers are that we can actually make an impact on by launching this feature? And usually it's almost like a brainstorming discussion to come up with those right metrics. And then the most important step is that everyone then agrees on exactly what it is that we're measuring, and then that you're actually logging the data. In an ideal world, you have a dashboard and everything is all set up perfectly. In reality, that may not always be the case, but I found that this sort of brainstorming approach is actually really, really helpful and engages the whole team with all the different perspectives that they're bringing to agree on what we're driving towards, and really get on the same page before that feature is anywhere close to going out the door.
I'm going to give a slightly different answer over here. Actually, this is one of my interview questions. When I interview PMs, I'm like, imagine you're in a room, you have to make a decision, you don't have data. What are you going to do, right? This is one of the interview questions. But the way I look at this, there's different kinds of data. There's qual data and quant data. And you need to understand, especially, when you're starting off on a feature and a product, right? What kind of data do you need to validate your hypothesis? I'm a chemistry major, so for me, I'm always going into like, okay, this is my hypothesis, this is how I'm going to test it, and this is the result, right? So I generally go through that. And a recent example of, and I just did that actually, was there was a feature that users kept, I kept hearing in my friend circle that, okay, this is just not working. And I was like, okay, we did a quick check-in with the team, and they're like, we don't think it's an issue at all. It's all good, it's just like not really. So I did a qual study with like 15 users in a cafe, we just did a quick qual study, and it validated my hypothesis that yes, this is a problem. And so, which helped me go to make it a bigger quant study because it requires resources to do 1,000 people user study and validate the hypothesis, which helped then build a prototype and test this. So that's the way kind of I look at it, again, because I come from a little filmmaking background and chemistry background. I'm like, okay, hypothesis, results, test. Good, we're good.
Yeah, so I have a unique and fortunate position where I actually work on both the back end as well as the front end features. And so on the back end, we do a lot of experimentation. We run hundreds of experiments in my team alone each quarter to find those incremental changes that can improve user experience or revenue or whatever it is for advertising. And then I work a lot as well now with Allie's team on the front end. And we actually just had this conversation about like, how can we make these very significant feature changes, right, in the UI that could have pretty profound revenue impact. It's not something you can just kind of throw out there and have like millions of like touch points and see if it like is 5% better or 0.5% better. And so I would love to have Allie actually talk a little bit more about how we do that with the front end, look at data prior to launching versus like putting something out there and just like trying to see if it sticks, right? And I think that's really significant because we don't just make incremental changes every day. We have to launch V2s of products and do things that are a little bit scary, and we really have to have the intuition to go about that, but we can use data to support that intuition.
Go ahead. Come back.
I was going to elaborate on the intuition point. A lot of times people ask, like, oh, what does it take to be a product manager at Google? And yes, there's like analytical or communications or technical or whatever the skills may be. But I do think one point that's often missed is the ability to empathize or to put yourself in other people's shoes. And this applies whether you're in a conversation with somebody or whether you're designing a product and whether you're trying to understand how the product is perceived by different sets of users. So I give the example of that many, many years ago. This was way before like Google was pretty much a series of blue vanilla links on the page. We were trying to launch product listing ads or shopping results with pictures. Pictures of products kind of make sense. When you show a product, you have a picture. That being said, on Google, on the web results, showing pictures was like, oh my God, all the metrics changed. Because there was a very accustomed to search, link, click, go. And so all the metrics that you tend to look at were oriented towards, is it a good user experience under that flow of search, links, click, and then go out? Is this a good user experience? And so we were trying to launch this thing, and it was very simple. It just had a set of pictures, and none of the metrics worked. Abandonment was up the roof, and we were trying to figure out why. That must be a terrible thing. People just came to Google and left. And in the end, we started to think about it and just pretend you're a user. Pretend you come in and you do a query, and you see a bunch of products. Well, that could be just seeing the prices in the pictures could be enough to tell you a little bit about that. It may not be a negative thing, but it could be enough. Maybe you might click on a product, but then you might do a short click and click back if that's not exactly the right product or a good product. So we started to make up new metrics and said, well, what if we combine some of the abandonment metrics with the short click metrics? Perhaps we can see something different. So I give this example as a case where there are always a series of metrics, and we have so many metrics that we look at on a day-to-day basis, and even ways to slice and dice and look at it from a variety of angles. But it's helpful to occasionally step back and think, okay, if I'm a user and I saw this, what would be good? What would be bad? What would be different reasons for the good and bad? And then to find the right metric for that, taking it from a fresh pair of eyes standpoint.
I think you've actually answered my next question. So this is very psychic of you, so thank you. The next thing I was going to ask, which I'll ask to the rest of the panel, is how do you avoid getting overloaded or paralyzed by metrics? As you said, there's so many different metrics you can look at. How do you just prevent complete paralysis for the team? Some things are going up, some things are going down. How have your teams tackled this?
Yeah, and it happens to me, and I will tell a personal story about this later. But one of the things that I have learned over the year is to define success. Like, what does success mean for the team? Like, apart from OKRs, and putting that in the PRD and say, everybody agree on the success, and how are we going to measure that success, right? So an example over years, last year, launched warranty for the Pixel devices, and we could measure a bunch of things with that. But as a team, we decided that the success is the sales of the Pixel devices, attachment of warranty to the Pixel device, and customer satisfaction, right? And everybody agreed to that metric, right? Not just cart abandonment, clicks, because there's just so much, right? If you don't agree to the success and to the definition of that success, then like you're going to have so many things, and you're going to I don't know what I'm going to measure. So that's how I've kind of been a little bit regimented about define every PRD or a doc has a success, and how are we going to measure it? And keep it open for a time for people to comment, agree, disagree, and then I close that document. And I'm like, this is what we agreed on, and we're going to stick to that until we decide otherwise.
I was going to add maybe along the lines of what you were mentioning earlier. So OKRs are also a great way to frame this problem. So for example, one of the projects that Yvonne and I are working on together, we actually set an OKR to collect the data we need to make the decision this quarter, and the following quarter we'll actually, flesh it out and build it and everything. So I think that can also be a useful framing device. So deadlines, realistic deadlines, don't assume you're just going to figure out what you're going to build and then also build it at the same time. It can be helpful in some of these more major changes or more far-reaching areas where there may be, unforeseen impact, that you actually do give yourself time to define the problem and get qualitative and quantitative research based on what we know so far, and then really focus on building out the product and building out the details. So that's been a helpful framing device, and doesn't push things out too much. It's not like, oh, well, we'll build it when we get the answer. It's actually kind of time boxing it in a way that everyone understands and agrees to.
So I think there are often times that you are trying to get the data, and the team is really trying to convince yourselves that this is something that you want to do. And then there are times that it's, adversarial. I mean, who's been in a situation where it's been adversarial and everyone's kind of coming with their own data, And it's like becoming this like knife fight, right? It's like, well, I have data that shows that, and I have data that shows this. I think it's important to kind of recognize those moments, like when you know, you're asking for more data or getting asked for more data in a sort of way that's like, you know, really weaponizing the use of data rather than like a kind of an honest critique of like whether or not this is something that we should be doing, right? And kind of recognizing that situation and then really time boxing it to make sure that, like, you know, if there's a story I have that, you know, just in the last quarter, we'd been looking at essentially an existence proof. Does this value exist that we can use for our reporting? And an existence proof can go on forever, right? Like if you didn't find it, doesn't mean you just haven't looked hard enough for it. And so it was important to time box that and also to recognize, is this a situation that we really don't have the data, or is it a situation where there's a team that just does not want to do this and is going to keep asking for this data in order to really kick that can down the road? And if that's the case, I think it's important to just kind of raise it and be like, what would convince you to change your mind? Like, let's just understand like what bar that would take and whether or not it's really realistic. And if we don't reach that point, let's just like figure out what to do next. And I think the last thing I would just say is, like, don't be that person who's like, I'm never going to do this, and so I'm going to keep asking for more data. So like, I think that's just kind of like a PSA.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely gotten that one. Oh, well, let's get some more data, you know, just postpone this decision forever. That's definitely a pitfall. So a little bit earlier, Yvonne mentioned that her team runs hundreds of experiments per quarter, which is amazing. I know when I was working on Google Play, that was something really big and really effective that we found. So let's talk more about experimentation. Google, we were sort of like really known early on, don't know what color to make the links to click on, just run an A/B test. That'll pick a color of green, right? We kind of went from there. Experimentation's always really been in our blood. So let's talk more about it. So when is experimentation great? When does it reach its limits? You can't experiment on everything. And how do you find the right balance? You know, at Google, we like to say launch and iterate. But if someone goes to the store and buys a brand new mobile phone, they don't expect us to launch and iterate on that, right? You expect it to work from day one because you spent $600, please. So let's talk about that. Experimentation, how is it great? What are the limits? And then how do we decide when we can kind of experiment with things and when we need to polish things internally, get them perfect before they see the light of day?
So I love experiments. I think I feel very lucky that at least there are certain areas, and at least the product that I work on, we're very lucky to be able to run an A/B experiment and see some data, sometimes within days or even a day or so, depending on the particular feature. And personally, I really like it because it gives me that hypothesis and then verification and validation. So it becomes a much more objective decision rather than a subjective, I guess, knife fight, but depends on how you use the data. So a part of me really likes that, and it really appeals to me. That being said, it does have its limits. I think there's a couple key areas, and it's cases where you don't have that much data. And it could be on a big product, but let's say you're looking at conversion rates or how often people are actually, in my case of my product, buying something at the end. And if it's a small tweak, you may not be able to see that actually in an A/B experiment. Or it could be a newer feature, a newer product that's going out where you don't have that data or you don't have enough data to draw a statistically significant conclusion for it. And what do you do in those cases? I would give two suggestions. One would be that there is also data from a softer angle. So data from either user studies, data from using it yourself. data from getting lots of feedback across whether it's what we call dog food, which is we eat our own products and we try our own products, or data from either user research or user surveys. It's not as kind of like hard A/B experiment data, but that softer data does provide a piece of feedback that's not entirely driven by who's building the particular feature, or your opinion versus your tech lead's opinion versus somebody else's opinion who's building the feature. It gives a little bit of that objectiveness as well. The other thing I would add would be sometimes you do need to go with your gut. And it is scary. I like data and I like experiments. But sometimes there are times when you need to go with your gut and see if something would work. Or go with your gut that, yes, this is a good feature. And this data may be in the gray, but I'm going to go with it and launch it because I do think, and we think as a team, that it is a good feature to launch. In those cases, what I would suggest would be find ways to at least iterate and verify that afterwards as well. So it's not just your launch and you're done. But if you launch, perhaps after launch, you can run what we call a holdback, or you can have some segment of users where you don't have that particular feature and you can see something there, or you can see the production metrics and you can measure it there. The bigger thing I would suggest would be making sure that you have a bit of that objectivity, whether it's through experiment metrics or whether it's through the softer kind of more anecdotal user surveys or user research, or post-launch, that you keep checking yourself. So it's not just, I think that's what it thinks, I think that would be good, or you think that'd be good, I think so too, and then we launch it. That we have that objective verification with it.
One thing I want to add over here is that we have the luxury of doing experiments. You cannot do that in filmmaking as much, and I have learned the hard way. We can do some check-ins when you're doing screenings, but in software, not in hardware, in software, we have the luxury of doing experiments. So I see experiments as something that lets me fail fast, often, and cheaply. Right? That's what experiments let me do. And so just to add to that, I think of experiments, not just experiments that are run in production, like, Jen touched upon this, but for myself, even for PMs, I like making videos. So sometimes when I build a prototype and just test that, even with team members. And if I can't build a prototype, I'll make a video. I'll make a video with screenshots of how the flow would be or how it would work and test it, right? Is it just me validating my own hypothesis by running a small experiment with a user set that I know? So that's how, I always did as experiments fail fast, often cheap, and see that they help with not wasting resources across, right? That's just kind of the way I see that.
So a key thing that we need to do as product managers is make decisions. So can you talk to us about more how to balance data, I think as Jen talked a little bit about, with other ways of making decisions and how it fits in with the overall product development process?
I think when we talk about product intuition, an important part they always say about product management is you can't assume that the user is like you. And so this is also data, but maybe not the harder type of data, is really around listening to users and listening to customers. And I think that's something that I've been really fortunate in all the companies I've worked at, small or large, that there's been a really strong discipline around user testing. And it gives you, it doesn't tell you the answers. Like, no one comes in and is like, you really should build this and it's going to become like Facebook someday or something like that, right? So what the important thing is there is to really understand users who are different from who you are, because otherwise you can get into a very narrow way of thinking. And that's something that I've been really, just in the year that I've been at Google, just watching the sort of the UX practice that we have, and the UXR, the research, is really an important and critical function. And so if, I know not everyone has large teams, but if that's something that you have to really leverage that, you might think, talking to 10 people is not the same as putting something in front of 1 million people and seeing if you have a better result. But those 10 people can reveal something that is different from like your own view of the world, even if you're the customer. Like, it's easy to be like, well, if I'm building an app for teenagers, right? Then I obviously have to talk to teenagers. I'm not a teenager. It's been a long time since I've been a teenager. But even when you think it's something that it's something that you could use, it's even more important to look at a diverse group of people under diverse situations to really expand your thinking. And that's where the intuition comes from, that lets you come up with the hypotheses that then you can test.
I'm sorry, I'm going to add something over here. So, Hindi movies, I don't know if you guys know about Bollywood films, Hindi films. When you go to see them, you have to put your logic aside. It's awesome, but you literally have to manage your emotional quotient to be higher and your logic lower, or else you're not going to enjoy them. And that's what I have learned after watching Hindi films as a product manager. You have to balance that data and emotion, like what Jen touched on, right? So you have to check whether how much do I push up my data logic quotient and how much do I push up, because if there's a product that you really feel passionately about, you're like, no, this is just the right way to do it, right? So you have to kind of step back and check that logic quotient with your emotional quotient. And if you want to learn how to do that, watch Hindi movies. Trust me, you'll learn.
So one thing I'll add as well is sometimes this comes down to, are you sort of leading the market or meeting the market in a given product space? So this comes up a lot. So I work on the YouTube ad space. We work with a lot of traditional brand advertisers, and that's an area where it can be difficult to introduce a new currency or a new buying concept or something that is different from what these companies have been experts at for many, many years. So that's where a lot of the customer discussions, going out and meeting customers in their place of business, talking to the sales teams, showing empathy, making it a two-way conversation is way more valuable than any data I could pull about what those companies are doing today. Because if that were the case, we would rebuild TV advertising, and that's not precisely what we're trying to do. So that's a good example of acknowledging when the data kind of tells you about what's going on now, but it's not going to tell you where to go. So that's, again, where the empathy and kind of building these skills in the customer-facing side of the world, or the user-facing side, can be so valuable. And those relationships can help you push further than you might be able to otherwise. If you're really the face of the product, or you're really putting a human name to what giant Google is doing, that can be a really, really valuable part of the process, and something that I've really enjoyed.
So maybe touch upon something slightly different but related. I think one of the implicit challenges of making decisions is when you don't agree. And I'm sure we've all faced situations, whether individually or in different groups or segments, where there are disagreements, where data can be interpreted in different ways, or used as a knife fight. But there is a disagreement. And what I found helpful is sometimes those disagreements aren't bad. It's not bad to have a disagreement. There are different perspectives. If anything, it's good to have that diversity of perspectives and different ways of thinking about the product, and checks and balances with each other. So don't think of disagreements as bad. And I think it is healthy, and I think it is good. That being said, I think disagreements can get unhealthy. So I would just suggest more from a people standpoint. You will face conflict. You will face disagreements in making decisions. And in those situations, it's helpful to also have empathy for the other person, and to try to put yourself in their shoes and really hear it out before you raise your guard and you're defensive. Like, all right, let me whip up my metrics, let me defend and fight it out. That you really try to step back and hear each other. And sometimes I found it helpful to make sure, okay, I hear you are saying blah, right? And they say, yes, okay. So at least they feel like, okay, I have heard you. I understand where you're coming from. I'm not faking it. I really do. Now hear me. These are some of the reasons that I think so. And this is very much a people thing. I don't think it's necessarily a product manager thing. But there are lots of situations where you do need to corral a decision in cases of disagreement, and in cases where data can be interpretive. And so it's helpful to remember some of the people aspect of doing things too.
Thank you. And speaking of disagreements, do any of you have any suggestions about how to convince different stakeholders, or how to use data when you're working with maybe an engineer versus your manager versus the sales team versus QA? These folks tend to have different styles of working and different types of things that are persuasive to them, or sometimes they may just have different individual personalities.
This is kind of building on what you said, but I've found it incredibly helpful to be the transparent person in the room, and to acknowledge, for example, if we're making a change. So, sometimes we do painful migrations, like we're moving from one backend to another backend, and like no one in sales or no customer, no user is going to be like, "Yay, a migration!" So that's where being transparent can be incredibly helpful. Like, I can't give you data that's going to say that this is going to make some huge difference. Like, our metric is neutrality. Like, we don't want to make anything worse. So that's what I can commit to you, and help me help you in making this a neutral experience, or as like unbad as possible. So something like that can be incredibly helpful, and just kind of getting on the same footing and not trying to dress something up that it cannot possibly be. And on the other extreme, like let's say we need to build something that's extremely challenging technically. So for example, we're redesigning the AdWords interface. That's a huge project. And a lot of that comes not from just, data and revenue metrics and things like that. It is all about users and building more around the user journeys and product excellence and things like that. So that's where being very non-quantitative can actually help with a large engineering team that needs to be convinced to put in years of work to rebuild an entire UI. So that's where using, it's almost the unintuitive choice, like you're going directly to the user journey, the user experience, and the customer, and how we can make the customer experience better, to really set the ground floor and the ground agreement on why we want to actually embark on this journey together. So I can sometimes see these, these sort of natural tensions in, or let me rephrase, so sort of natural inclinations on the types of data that you use with customers versus engineers versus executives. And sometimes it's almost admitting it's not about that this time. Let me actually explain to you why I think this is important, or why I think we have to do this, and then sort of take the conversation from there.
Just to build on that, you can't show up with a list of metrics or data. So even with engineers, I think maybe your inclination is like, well, these people are very quantitative and like very technical, and they want to know just the facts. But really, you need to think in terms of stories, right? So what is the narrative around what you're trying to convince someone to do? And that might be adjusted for the different audience. It's not just a function. One engineer and a different engineer might have a different mode. You have to read that audience. But any persuasion there has to be have a narrative to it that really like sparks their interest and their imagination for why this is such a critical piece of work, right? And data helps support that. But it's an important thing to kind of note, especially when we're in a culture that's so data driven. Definitely we'll see PMs who like come armed with their data, but like don't have the larger picture that really captures people's imaginations.
So we talked a lot about data, but one thing we haven't talked about much is how diversity and inclusion comes up in our jobs as PMs, both in terms of how we think about users and building for very broad and diverse user bases. At Google, we have a number of different products that have over 1 billion users each. So with such a large part of the world, we need to make sure that we're very inclusive in our design and product thinking. Additionally, diversity and inclusion can also come up in our lives working with our teams and our colleagues. So I think especially with this group, that's something that's interesting to talk about.
All right, so I said earlier, disagreements, conflict, different opinions, this is good. And I think I think the same applies, especially from a diversity standpoint. You bring a different set of perspectives onto the table. And I think that helps to round about and provide checks and balances. So it's very, very important to have that diversity, whether it's from a gender standpoint or a background standpoint or whatever it may be. That being said, I also hold to, it's also important to remember you are not the user, or you are at least not the only user. And so sometimes, despite your background, despite your prior associations or your preferences or your likes, it's important to remember that. I'll give the example of, so I work on Google Shopping. and there's lots of apparel shopping. And it's not uncommon to be in a room and then everybody turns to me and says, "What do you think about buying dresses?" And I go, "I don't know. I buy some dresses, but I don't represent all people who buy dresses. I don't think so. I can tell you how I shop for dresses. That's one data point." And so I do think it's very important, while it is good to bring that diversity of perspectives while building the product, that you also are careful in understanding that it's not, that you are not the only user, and to still have that checks and balances from a broader diversity standpoint and getting a broader user sampling or more objective user sampling for it, even if you may have biases or background that may be related to that particular feature or product.
All right. So right before we move to questions, I want to give each of our panelists a quick chance to give one piece of advice to all of you here today.
We're all thinking.
You ready, or do you want me to like stall a little bit? Yeah? You want me to give a comedy skit? I have a piece of advice. If you're ever not sure how to do public speaking and you feel very uncomfortable, you should try doing improv comedy, and you'll feel very uncomfortable for a short period of time, and then the rest of your life will be easier from there. It's working already. I highly recommend it. You should do it. If it feels very uncomfortable, you should definitely do it. Okay, who's next?
Thank you for stalling. All right, one piece of advice I would have. My advice would be to keep perspective. And I think this is important from a variety of angles. It's important that you keep perspective as you're working in a particular group to be able to understand somebody else's perspective. It's helpful as you're working on a particular feature to understand the bigger picture of how that feature fits in to the product, to what you're trying to achieve from a broader organization or product area, or even Google standpoint. It's important to keep that perspective. It's also important to keep perspective in terms of like life and you and what's important to you. And that could be work, that could be family, that could be friends, that could be hobbies, it could be films. But it's also important to keep that perspective, because I think that keeps you grounded at work. Just having that tweak in mindset of that perspective helps to keep you grounded through the day-to-day as you work through things, as you obsess about a particular feature, to have that broader perspective. And then lastly, I would say that also the biggest perspective, also there's a big world outside of your individual kind of area. And so it's helpful to keep that perspective. And there's what you see, what you do every day, and you may be stressed out and working through things. But also keep in mind there's a big world out there, a lot of people out there, and to keep perspective in how lucky we all are to be in this room today, how lucky I feel to be in this room today, and to have that broader perspective in mind. It keeps at least me grounded on a day-to-day basis, and it helps me kind of on either a particular feature, a particular product, my day-to-day life, and my life in general.
That's so hard to follow. My advice is around imposter syndrome. Does everybody know imposter syndrome? When you think you're the one who for sure doesn't belong in this room. I had a little bit of that going into this room tonight. And it's been something that I've personally kind of struggled with and needed to become accustomed to and ignore over the course of my PM career in particular. Since I don't have a traditional tech background, since I came from sales, I was always sure that like I was the one who snuck in, or I just knew the right people who like got me in the door and I really don't belong here. So as we've talked about tonight, so this is actually something that has really helped me, is like the different perspectives you can bring to a product and the different types of data that there are. It's not all doing queries and getting the exact right data point to make sure that the product you're building is the right one. It's bringing in the user perspective. It's bringing in the perspectives of different teams. It's bringing in a different background in, you know, your academic life or your extracurricular life. That can really contribute to making a team work together more closely and more effectively. So even though it's something I have struggled with myself, I would definitely give the advice that if you feel this imposter syndrome, especially going into, a data-driven space, acknowledge it, but everybody feels that way, and we all need to move past it in a certain way, and you deserve to be here.
The piece of advice I'll give is what I have got from my mentors over my career, and there are two pieces. One is you don't get what you deserve. When I was growing up, anyone said, you got what you deserve. I'm like, no, you don't get what you deserve. You get what you negotiate. You get what you negotiate, and we as women sometimes don't negotiate. We need to negotiate, right? And something that's tied to which I hold very close to my heart is don't take no for an answer. Just don't negotiate. Like, there's this a movie called Galaxy Quest. I don't know if you guys know that, or if you're like science fiction nerds. It's a parody on Star Trek. It's one of my all-time favorites movie, and I can watch it every weekend. Like, there's a quote in that which says, never give up, never surrender. And I hold that very close to my heart. So whenever there's like a big problem, I'm like, okay, I'll park this, but I'll come back to it. So, I'm like, I will not give up. And my kids know that as well. So when they know that maybe there are passes for Universal that are not available, they'll send their mom, and mom will negotiate and get those passes.
I would say something that's been very important and that I keep working on is to continue to keep learning. So over this past year, so I joined Google a year ago, I've been learning so much. And I left a situation that was super, super like comfortable for me. I'd gotten to that place in a company where I'd built out a lot of the product and had the reputation and had just a really good spot. And I feel like maybe it's something that we often optimize for, is that feeling of being really belonging and having gotten that spot, that it's so easy to really relish that and to leave that and to learn something completely different and to really struggle with that, because there's a lot of technology and a lot of people and a lot of ways things are done it's not easy. Many a night I've come home entirely exhausted, entirely mentally exhausted from just having to kind of like switch and change and learn and do things completely differently. And I think it's something I wouldn't trade for anything else. And I would encourage that. And I haven't always done that in my career. There's definitely been times I've been in a job for 11 years because I was just awesome at it. But this is something that like I continue to push myself to do, and I would really encourage you to as well.
Thank you so much for your advice. Now we would love to move to your questions. So I think how this is going to work is we have a microphone, but because we're recording the session and the microphone doesn't work with that, we're going to try to get you to say the question in that microphone, and then I'm going to repeat it. So don't be alarmed if that's what happens. Okay, let's do it. Let's grab some questions.
Thank you. It's really inspiring tonight. My question's around, as someone who's been in product for only about 3 to 4 years, I'm struggling to find my space. There's so much technology, everything's up and coming. How do you find your niche of a product or a space that you're comfortable with, that you're known for?
Okay, so for the recording, she's been a product manager for about 3 to 4 years, and she's wondering, how do you find your niche? There's so many different types of technology and different product areas. How do you find that niche? Any thoughts?
So I think it's important, and I think you're really hitting upon it, is that you need to be in a space and inhabit that space and become an expert in that space and for a certain amount of time. And there's just, there's something that you can't trade off time in a lot of ways. Like everyone wants to be like, accelerated and, getting further ahead, but just inhabiting that space and understanding the technology and knowing the people, and then whether it's, software, hardware, or digital, or, if you're working in something that's SAS enterprise versus consumer, like really inhabiting that space and becoming that expert, is you have to stick with it. And I think that's one of the things that there's so much opportunity in Silicon Valley that it's kind of like easy to be like going from like different types of roles. Or maybe, I've heard this as well, as there's folks that I mentor who are in enterprise and maybe want to work in consumer. And so then it's like, how do I make that jump? And there's something to be said for like inhabiting and really becoming an expert in the space that you have, that there's so many things that I've done in my past that are completely unrelated to what I do today, but contribute to it every day because I've had the ability to really marinate and really excel in something, and I can carry that forward.
One thing I want to add over there is, as a PM, I have learned this. There are different types of PM and different qualities of PM. There's a ninja PM who knows everything about data. There's this visionary blue sky PM, right? So there are different types of PM. Know what kind of PM you are, know your strengths, and know your weaknesses, but don't obsess about them, right? So that's one thing that I have learned over the years, that yes, I have these weaknesses. I'm not good at this. I always want to get better at that, but I don't obsess over them. And I surround myself with people who are very good at that so that it kind of balances.
I would sort of echo what Yvonne was mentioning. So something that I have found that sort of looking backwards sort of frames my career is that at each moment, I kind of defined a universe of stuff that I could do and that I could change and that I could make an impact in. And that universe may be way smaller than something that I ultimately want to do, or it may seem like not the most exciting part of my career at that moment, but the most important part was actually getting practice like within that universe of things. And it can be super frustrating if you're trying to change something that's out there and you have like absolutely no power and no resources to do that. So it's awesome to aim for that thing, but also kind of get that sort of practical day-to-day practice of making trade-offs, building a product story. It's really like the nuts and bolts of PMing, and I think that can happen really in any area of any product, and a lot of those skills are transferable over time, and the most important part is getting that practice. So that doesn't mean you should just stay working on some product that you hate, of course, but it can help to sort of put in perspective what you can and cannot do in your individual role at the moment, and still kind of make the most of that practice and build those skills along the way.
So I may suggest one tweak, just tweak in thinking, or a suggestion. I think there's like figuring out and being an expert in your space. So consumer, UI really well. I know enterprise really well. I know machine learning really well. So I have that space and I know things. And I think that's one way of thinking about it and growing in that area. And there's definitely that in any job that you do, and learning about that particular space and becoming an expert and learning about it. The tweak I would add would also be in growing in how you think and in how you work. And I feel like that is often what takes you to the kind of the next step, and the next step as kind of a longer term. The domain knowledge you learn, it changes. Things are moving at a fast pace nowadays. And so whatever you learn, likely in a couple years, it's out of date. And so I think there's the domain knowledge, but I think what stays is more how you think and how you work. So an example for me, and this is maybe more me individually, I like to think, and some people think I'm slightly crazy when I say this, but I like to think in terms of ecosystems. I like to think in terms of, okay, there's a user, there's maybe some partner, and then there's the revenue or the long term, and I optimize. And I try to put myself in different people's shoes, in different angles, and look at a product from that standpoint. And look at that kind of that way of thinking about a product. So it's not purely optimizing from a pure consumer angle or a pure customer angle or a pure revenue angle. And that is where an example of where I like to think in that way. It's not a particular domain expertise, but it is something that I have found very helpful. And I continue to grow and try to learn in that area too.
We'll take the next question.
Hi. As an engineering student, one thing I've noticed with product managers that I work with is that they have the ability to really look at the details, for example, of how something is implemented or specific data points, but they're also able to like move back and have the bird's eye perspective. So my question was, how do you guys navigate zooming in and out of your product
So for the recording, the question comes from an engineering student. This person has seen product managers balance both zooming in on the details of the project as well as looking at the larger perspective. So any advice on how to do that?
So I may plagiarize a little bit if that's okay. There's a video out there by Sukhinder Singh. She used to work at Google long ago, and she talks a lot about that. And for me, that was very inspiring. She talks about how there are folks that fly high, and they're like the big, maybe perhaps like the visionary kind of people, and they are at the 10,000 foot level, but they stay at the 10,000 foot level. And then there are folks that are at the nitty gritty details, and they're very comfortable. They know all the details, and they're very into the details. And I think it's about knowing when to fly high and when to fly low. That's important, especially as a product manager. And it's knowing what situation warrants which type of a degree. And as a product manager or just as a person, it's helpful to also have that trait. And it's something that I look for as well. Are you able to fly high and fly low? Or are you able to only do one or the other?
One thing that was helpful for me, and it's a great question because it's like at the core of PMing, and it becomes a huge challenge. Like the more products you're managing, the more people you're managing, it's really hard to zoom into the details on each one of these things. So one area where I think I sort of trained myself to do this was in a kind of like a final version versus like a V1 of a product. It's a really good example of sort of building the overall narrative of a product, and then you execute on the like minimum viable first version. And it's not exactly the same thing as zooming in and zooming out across, multiple stages of a product or a whole organization or a very large team, but it kind of trains you to like look up at the forest and then look back at the tree in each stage of the product to kind of stay on track to that larger vision while you're still looking at, oops, got to fix this bug, need to figure out, the actual like individual implementation of this first part of this first feature. So it can be a helpful sort of framing device to keep, I guess, the eye on the ball, to take like the earlier metaphor, and while you're still executing on the details. So it's a similar framework, like when you're trying to do the same thing across projects that are already in flight at different stages of their life cycle.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. Curious to see which one she's going to go for. Okay. Yes.
I wanted to ask, so there's the product component of PMing, there's also a lot of the people component. We've been talking about how you use data for product. I'm wondering if you have any data collection experiment procedures that you use with the people side of the work.
I'll take this one as the hippie on the panel. All right, so for the recording, the question was, we have methods on data collection on the product side, but what about data collection on the people side? I'll tell you an interesting fun fact about Google. There's some trainings where you actually like get personality tests on your coworkers. Like people will take these tests and like share, I have, this Myers-Briggs type thing and things like that. So it's actually kind of interesting when you have at least a sort of people that you're working with, to actually ways to kind of categorize different instincts that people have. I guess data collection on the people side, maybe could you clarify a little bit more about what you mean by that? I'm kind of confused. Like there's a lot of analytics packages. You can see what people are doing in your product. Like, what is
your coworkers. Like,
okay.
Do you consciously try out like different meeting strategies?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so we actually have some classes at Google that go into kind of like how to work, like part of like there's a kind of a group exercise where you can do, you kind of see which personality categories people fall into, and you can choose to believe in this or not. But it was really interesting. One time I was in a team and we did this exercise and we sort of saw who sort of fit into, I was the only person, of course, in the driven personality category. So I had to sit in a corner by myself, which was really hard for me because, And then there was like a data-driven personality type category, and there was kind of an action-oriented and then sort of a process-oriented. And we got into a really interesting conversation about how essentially some tensions that we've been having in the team are really about some people like to execute and do things quickly, whereas others really valued having a lot of data and doing a lot of analysis and doing the right thing as opposed to doing the fast thing. So, you know, how do you decide between the right thing and the fast thing? It was actually really helpful, I thought, to see that that was just about different people's approaches. It wasn't like you're stupid and you're dumb and you're bad and you're wrong. It was like, oh, I see. Now that we have a structure for talking about the different approaches that people take, it's actually much easier to see that it's not a person, like sort of like a personal conflict, but more of a conflict of different approaches. And so we could have much more interesting conversations about, as an organization, when we want to prioritize, let's say, moving fast versus more detailed data-driven decisions. How do we make that? You know, how do we choose between the two? Obviously, choosing one all of the time is probably wrong, but then we were able to look at those decisions a little bit more objectively and take a step back and go, okay, those are two valid approaches that both have good and bad things about them, and then how do we decide in each individual situation where we want to put that slider between, you know, thoughtful, planned, maybe takes a lot longer decisions, and let's get it done and fix the emergency and move quickly on to the next thing and innovate type of decisions.
So what Ellie referred to is as the colors. Are you referring to colors? Yeah. So whenever I join a team, generally I try and do the colors so I know where people are, because like you said, and then it depends on, once I know what type of people are, what I'm going to lead with, right? If somebody is a relationship person, I will set up a meeting to discuss that. If somebody's a data-driven person, I'll send them an email with full of data and then I will meet them, right? So it's just kind of like knowing that what kind of a person they are. And generally in a team, actually we haven't done this in our recent team, we do this as a team exercise. So we kind of, everybody knows, it's not just me knowing, but everybody knows what kind of a person. It's at a high level, not, you know, do that. And people do jump around those colors as well. Like I started off as a green and now I'm a green blue, so I've become a little bit more people person.
Actually, do we have time for a quick story? Yeah. Okay. Okay, really, really quick then. Sorry, it reminded me of it. I do think there are different people, different colors, different styles. And one thing I do want to emphasize is I also think that is good. And I think we should have like groups and things with different styles, whether it's loud, whether it's aggressive, whether it's data-driven, whether it's the intuition-driven. And I think that is helpful in building a better product. I'll give a quick story of more of a context. Many years ago, I worked on this team. And it was with the most randomest people that you can imagine. Like you can't imagine, it was hard to imagine any of them hanging out outside of work, any two of them hanging out together, because they were just completely random. There was really loud, and then there was really passionate, and then there was very conservative, and then there was the quizzical one, and then there was the person who was always like, okay, I want to understand the data, the one that was passion driven, and different genders, different ages, different backgrounds, and it was a really random team. That being said, it was one of the best teams I've ever been on. Because it was so random that there were no cliques. There was no group A versus group B because everybody didn't fit in. And so because of that, everybody who joined and everybody fit in because nobody fit in. And it was one of the best teams ever because we didn't have that click A versus click B, front end versus back end, you versus me. It was just a lot of people trying to figure out, bringing different styles and perspectives to the table about how to build this product and how to build it forward. And it was one of the best teams I've ever been on, and it's something that I always strive to replicate moving forward as well.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. I want to say thank you to all of you as well. Thank you to Launchpad, and thank you for Women in Product for helping us make this event possible. It's been great to get to meet some of you tonight. And if you are interested in Google, please come check out careers.google.com. We are hiring great product managers, and we'd be excited to meet you if you're interested.